Hey guys, tonight we begin with a gentle journey into one of the most quietly mysterious corners of modern history, the strange, unsettling and deeply intriguing world of the CIA's most unusual classified files, 13 documents they never expected us to read. As we drift together into this calm investigation, we'll explore secret psychic programs, mind-altering experiments, out-of-body travel techniques, occult research, buried in forgotten archives, and the whispers of contact with intelligences we still cannot name. We will move slowly, softly, and with intention, allowing each idea to unfold like a low-hanging mist over a quiet valley at night. Tonight, we will be opening the door gently to all 13 of these enigmatic files. We'll begin with the CIA's secret attempts to build a psychic army, then move into mind control experiments that left deeper marks than history remembers. We'll explore astral projection as described in scientific language, the occult research the CIA quietly buried, experiments on enhanced humans, real-world telekinesis tests, psychic explorers viewing off-world locations, and UFO encounters the agency monitored without public acknowledgement. And as we go deeper into the night, we'll gently approach the stranger documents, the ones that hint at contact with non-human intelligences, distortions of time, sightings of unidentified shadows inside secure facilities, and finally, the documents the CIA still refuses to release, even today. All of this, presented slowly, calmly, softly, as a peaceful documentary designed to keep your mind relaxed, your breathing steady, and your body growing heavier with each passing moment. And guys, I invite you to watch until the very end tonight, because the final chapters bring together clues scattered throughout the entire journey. Everything connects in a way that's easy to understand, soothing to listen to, and deeply satisfying for the mind. Before we settle in and begin our peaceful journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if what I share here truly resonates with you. Your support helps me create more of these long, quiet explorations. And if you feel like it, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always comforting to see how many corners of the world quietly meet here each night. Now, dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together as we explore what lies ahead. Chapter 1: The Stargate Program, America's Secret Psychic Army. Imagine yourself in a quiet room, low lights, soft hums of the ventilation system, the faint smell of old paper and cold metal. This was the atmosphere inside a small group of buildings scattered across US military bases in the 1970s, places where the government quietly assembled what some later called America's Psychic Army. Officially it was called the Stargate Program, a real initiative, funded quietly for over 2 decades, where trained remote viewers were taught to extend their awareness beyond physical limits, to observe distant places, hidden facilities, and even off-world landscapes, all without ever leaving their chairs. The public story is simple. The CIA wanted to know if psychic spying was possible, but the deeper layers, the ones that only surfaced in fragments when the files were declassified, painted a far stranger, far more compelling picture. Let's drift into this slowly, as if we're easing down a long hallway lined with locked doors, each door leading to a forgotten session. One session, now heavily redacted, described a remote viewer being given a set of coordinates. No context, no explanation, just numbers. And when he closed his eyes, slowed his breathing, and entered the stillness they trained him for, he said he saw structures, long corridors of metal, pillars arranged in patterns that didn't match any military facility known at the time, a subterranean layout. deeper than anything he'd seen before. What made the moment eerie, and why the transcription team stamped the page with additional classification marks, was that when analysts later attempted to cross-reference those coordinates, the location didn't appear on any satellite map the agency possessed. There was no such facility, not on paper, not on imagery, not in any official registry. Yet the viewer described it with certainty, as if he were walking its halls. Another remote viewer claimed he had locked onto a distant structure beneath the Siberian permafrost. It was the only transcript from the program where the entire coordinate field was fully blacked out upon release. Even decades later, those numbers remain redacted, replaced by a thick bar of black ink that feels almost like a warning. What was the viewer not supposed to see? What was so sensitive that even the coordinates, not the description, not the analysis, but the coordinates themselves, had to stay hidden? There is a story often told quietly among former intelligence personnel. A viewer, known only by the alias Eagle One, once described entering a mental state where he felt as though he was being observed back. He said he sensed a consciousness on the other end of the viewing, not hostile, not frightened, but aware, present. The transcripts of that session are missing entirely from the declassified files, but several analysts from the time have testified separately that the viewer abruptly quit the program shortly after that day. One described him as pale, disoriented, like he'd seen something that shouldn't exist. And in a soft, steady voice during a later interview, one of the project officers simply said, "Remote viewing wasn't just about observing. Sometimes it felt like you were tapping into something that didn't expect you to knock." That line has stayed with many who study the Stargate archives. Another curiosity lies in the margins of the handwritten CIA notes. In one session, a viewer described what he called geometric fields surrounding structures underground, shapes and alignments that didn't match known architectural techniques. Small triangles, intersecting arcs, and faint luminescent patterns he said were not man-made or not made by our hands. Now, the fictional elements blend here with the declassified truth, not to deceive, but to reflect the kinds of stories whispered around the program. Stories analysts and operatives carried with them for years. Some claim the program wasn't shut down because it was ineffective, but because it was too effective, revealing things the government wasn't prepared to confront or couldn't publicly acknowledge. And there's one more rumour, spoken in very quiet circles. A remote viewer allegedly slipped into a session where he perceived not a facility, not a landscape, but something like a vast presence. A field of consciousness he described as not singular, but unified, like multiple minds moving as one. He said it felt vast, old, organised. That session too is missing. Tonight, as we continue through these chapters, we will revisit many echoes from this project. Because the Stargate program didn't exist in isolation. It connects to nearly every strange document the CIA tried to keep hidden. And in later chapters, you'll see how these threads weave together into something much bigger. And in the quiet of this moment, as you breathe slowly and let your body soften, think of how odd it is that one of the US government's longest-running, most heavily funded Cold War projects was built around the belief that human consciousness can reach across space, a belief the CIA spent millions of dollars testing, a belief they never fully denied, a belief that, when the documents finally surfaced, felt less like speculation and more like confirmation. Chapter 2. Project MKULTRA. Mind control experiments that never officially ended. Settle deeper into your pillow now and let your eyelids grow heavier. Tonight we drift into darker, slower waters, into a program whose name has become a quiet legend in the corridors of secrecy, Project MK Ultra. We move gently, not to shock but to understand, to trace the soft, lingering footprints it left behind in the pages, the diaries, the redactions, and in the memories of those who stepped too close. MKUltra began, in the most prosaic terms, as a panic-era inquiry. Could the human mind be manipulated? During a time when nations feared one another's secrets, intelligence officers asked whether they could steer thought, erase memory, or prompt loyalty. The program's publicly known elements are stark, drugs, most famously LSD, hypnotic techniques, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and a variety of behavioral experiments carried out in hospitals, prisons, and universities. The records that did surface after court battles and hearings revealed a web of sub-projects and contractors, some legitimate academic labs, others less formal, all paid to test the boundaries of consciousness. But the documents are only the beginning. The imagery that stays with us is quieter: a fluorescent room, a metal gurney, the distant hiss of a radiator, the soft scratching of a nurse's pen. One such nurse, whose diary later leaked in fragments, wrote in trembling, handwritten lines about nights that never finished. She described subjects brought in blindfolded, their names stripped from charts, their speech slow and puzzled. In an entry dated to a late winter evening, she scrawled, "Room 3 had something that was not like the others. Not human, perhaps, but we were told to treat it as patient. Eyes that reflected light back like a camera, and it never slept." The entry was brief, almost elliptical, the handwriting narrowing as though she'd been afraid to finish the sentence. This is where reality brushes the uncanny. From the official files, we know there were experiments on volunteers and unwitting subjects. We know there were financial shell companies and locations chosen for their plausible deniability. But between the typed memos and the faded ink of diaries lie the stories people tell in quieter places. Stories that suggest the program's edges reached into rooms no official report could explain. A man, later identified only as Subject B in redacted documentation, gave a sealed testimony in the 1980s. He described, in a voice that trembled and then softened, a series of sessions where the boundaries between hearing and knowing blurred. He recounted waking from a ritual of lights and administered substances with words inside his head, not as a remembered phrase, but as an instruction woven into his awareness. He would find himself following orders he scarcely understood, compelled by an inner voice that carried the same cadence every time. After the sessions ended, he said, the voice did not leave. It waited, patient as a shadow. Scientists and psychiatrists who later interviewed him found his case puzzling. There were no clear neurological lesions, no obvious cause, only a lived experience that, to him, felt as real as the breath he drew. A rumour, whispered by a former technician who refused to be named on record, suggests there were sessions where audio instructions were played, but only some subjects reported external sound. Others, he said, reported commands arriving as inner speech, as though someone had learned how to press tiny buttons in the mind and make it speak without air. He described the room where he worked as quiet as a tomb, the equipment clinical and precise, wires like veins across the floor. On one sheet of paper he found, penciled in the margins in a tight, neat hand, was a note. Non-audible induction appears to bypass cortical monitors. Recommend further study. The paper was later burned, according to his account, but those words lingered as evidence of something more than mere pharmacology. Across the formal records, MKUltra's experiments often read like bad science fiction. Sensory isolation tanks used to unmoor perception, hypnotic regressions that sought to plant new memory, and biochemical cocktails aimed at lowering the mind's defenses. Yet the human side, the small, enduring strangeness in a nurse's diary, the reticent technician, the subject who hears voices after a session, gives the program a different texture. It moves from abstract ethics hearings into lived moments where reality itself felt rearranged. Consider, too, the notion of non-human subjects. The phrase is unpopular and discomforting, but it appears, in fragments, in a handful of obscure notes and marginalia. A physician's lab log once recorded an anomalous charting error, a subject whose physiological readings did not match human norms, a skin temperature that refused to correlate with core readings, pupils that dilated in ways the charts did not predict. The log entry itself was later annotated. Specimen, atypical, consult. The consult note is blacked out in later releases. We do not have a clear, documented trail to conclude anything definite. And yet, the nurse's line, not like the others, and the lab's furtive consult hover at the edge of what was publicly permissible to record. In the decades since many of MKUltra's files were destroyed or redacted, researchers have triangulated the remaining fragments, finding patterns and anomalies. We see requests for funding that cite standard psychological research. We see clandestine payments to sympathetic clinicians. We see institutional veneer over experimental methods that would now fail modern ethical reviews. But woven through these bureaucratic papers are the human echoes, men and women who, years later, could describe a sudden, invasive clarity, the sensation of a thought planted as if by another hand, a prisoner who woke one morning with his memories reorganized, a student who left a lab with a compulsion to repeat certain phrases. These are not the simple outcomes of randomized trials. They read like testimonies of an intimate intrusion. Let us consider methods for a moment, in a calm, observational way. Psychoactive substances were one avenue. Hypnosis and suggestion were another. Isolation and sensory deprivation were tested to see how the mind reconstructs reality when external cues are removed. And then there were the unorthodox experiments, the ones that slip into the margins of memos, tests combining audio and subliminal patterns, devices designed to shape the timing of pulses and rhythms so the brain might entrain to a commanded cadence. The declassified documents show the agency's fascination with the possibility that thought could be guided as surely as a ship by a lighthouse beam. The fiction woven into the files suggests they move from hypothesis to applied technique, sometimes with unforeseen consequences. One quietly devastating story involves a clinician who kept a private set of notes, never meant to be reviewed. After the official MKUltra disclosures, these notes surfaced briefly in an archive, then vanished again. In them, the clinician described a participant who, following a prolonged session, exhibited an altered sense of time, hours collapsing into minutes, memories folding upon one another. The clinician wrote, with a careful compassion, that the participant's narrative coherence had frayed like a rope left wet and then frozen. He cannot tell me when he was himself, the clinician wrote. He keeps saying there were layers of instruction he cannot peel away. That note disappeared from public view, but the sentiment, that certain interventions left people living in palimpsests of identity, never quite disappeared from conversations among those who study the case. And then there is the anxious suggestion that MKUltra never truly ended. Perhaps some programs were terminated, perhaps public hearings and congressional scrutiny forced closed doors to remain shut. But secrecy has a way of finding new containers. The files that remain redacted, the vaults that resist FOIA requests, and the occasional off-record mention by retired officers all feed a narrative that the appetite for knowledge about consciousness, about manipulation, did not vanish when official programs were disbanded. It evolved, migrated, and sometimes hid beneath other projects. We cannot prove this from the documents we possess alone, but the human fragments, the diaries, the testimonies, the technician's burned note, suggest a continuity of interest that is harder to dismiss. As we float through this chapter, let the details wash over you like a slow river. Think not of sensational claims, but of the human cost, confused memories, sleepless nights, strange compulsions, and the private recordings of caregivers who felt their own certainties shift. These are the textures by which we understand what MKUltra truly touched, not just procedures in a lab, but the lived worlds of ordinary people whose nights were rearranged by experiments they neither asked for nor fully remembered. Before we close this chapter, I'll offer a quiet thought to hold as you drift. The most telling documents are not always the ones with the boldest claims. Sometimes they are the small, careful scrawls in the margins, the burned paper, or the diary line that ends mid-sentence. Those are the human breadcrumbs that lead us deeper into the story. In later chapters, we will return to some of these breadcrumbs, to the Stargate Project's eerie encounters, to surveillance logs of shadows in secure facilities, and to a final cluster of redactions that seem to sit at the center of a much larger puzzle. Each piece fits like a small, cool stone in a stream, guiding us forward toward a larger, quieter conclusion. For now, rest with the knowledge that what we have seen is real and recorded, and what remains hidden is worth our gentle, persistent curiosity. The past does not always fully explain itself, but tonight we will continue to sit with these mysteries and listen. Chapter 3: The Gateway Process. Classified techniques for out-of-body travel. Ease deeper into your bed. Feel the mattress beneath you, the slow rise and fall of your chest, the steady rhythm of your breath. Tonight we slip into a quieter kind of science, a study of consciousness that reads like a patient attempt to describe a sea simply by watching the ripples. The gateway process, as it's come to be called in the documents that surfaced, is one of those rare moments where scientific language brushes up against the ineffable, and we're left with reports that sound like field notes from an expedition into inner space. The recorded, declassified core of the gateway story is familiar to many. A methodical, carefully written analysis from the early 1980s that treated out-of-body experiences, altered states, and certain meditative techniques as phenomena that could be described, measured, and, perhaps, trained. The authors approached the subject with a restrained curiosity. They measured heart rates, tracked breathing, and listened to anecdotal reports, all while trying to place these experiences within a framework that an intelligence agency could understand and possibly use. But beyond the clinical pages lie the human moments, the breathy, thinly typed session notes, the margin scribbles in the hand of someone who had watched an experiment and felt their certainties shift, and the lingering testimonies of people who say they travelled not by car or plane, but by mind. These elements give the Gateway Files a texture that is both scientific and strangely intimate. Imagine a small, windowless room padded for quiet, warm to a comfortable temperature, a reclining chair facing a low lamp. Participants were often guided through sequences of breathing, vocal toning, and auditory patterns. A key tool in the Gateway method was sound, layered tones delivered through headphones that encouraged the brain's hemispheres to fall into synchronized rhythms. The papers call this hemispheric synchronization, and at heart it is a simple, elegant idea. If the left and right side of the brain fall into the same rhythmic pattern, the way attention and perception function can subtly shift. The Monroe Institute, a civilian group working for decades on similar techniques, popularised these sound approaches under the name hemi-sync. The Gateway documents describe experiments that used these and similar protocols to create a stable state, wherein participants reported experiences that went beyond ordinary memory or imagination. One subject wrote afterward, in a voice both childlike and ancient, that the process felt like walking down a hallway of light. Another compared it to loosening a tight knot inside the head so that thought itself could move more fluidly. The Gateway analyst recorded these descriptions, not as poetry to be dismissed, but as data worth correlating with physiological measures. They watched for consistent patterns, changes in pulse, in galvanic skin response, in EEG rhythms. When experiences aligned with measurable shifts, the project officers leaned in. We should pause on the scientific frame because it matters. These investigators were not mystics. They were trained to look for repeatable phenomena. That attempt to bring structure to subjective experience is what gives the Gateway archive its quiet force. The method combined breathing, relaxation, rhythmic sound, and guided imagery to foster states where some participants reported moving their awareness beyond their bodies. Those reports range from gentle sensations of floating above the room to vivid journeys that felt like travelling across landscapes not bounded by geography. Now, in the margins of some released pages, there are notes that read less like neutral observation and more like a person who has seen something that unsettles the categories available to them. One officer, an analyst whose handwriting leans right and tight, jotted after a long session. Participant halted mid-description, eyes open but unresponsive, reports seeing others in a room not present here, claims contact with someone like me, but not me. The margin note pauses and then adds, recommend cross-check with remote viewing transcripts. That small sentence is like a thread linking Gateway to Stargate, suggesting the techniques were not explored in isolation, but as part of a wider institutional curiosity about consciousness and what it might access. There are transcripts from sessions where an analyst notes, almost clinically, that a participant froze halfway through a guided audio sequence. The participant later described a sensation of being held in place by an intelligence that was neither aggressive nor benign, simply curious. Others reported encountering presences that offered them images, names, or brief flashes of landscapes that did not correspond to any known map. These details were often redacted or simply left as notes without conclusive interpretation. Still, the pattern repeats enough that it asks for attention. One story, passed down in interviews with retired personnel, involves an analyst who used the Gateway methodology on himself after hours. He described entering a deep state where spatial boundaries softened. He reported being aware of two simultaneous perceptions, one of his body reclining in a chair and a second perception of gliding above his neighbourhood, suspended and gentle. He tried, experimentally, to touch his physical arm from that other vantage. The sensation, he wrote later in a personal memorandum, was like reaching through velvet. He found small, unexpected sensory confirmations afterward. The scent of rain hanging in his nasal memory despite a dry evening, and a neighbouring dog barking at a moment he later correlated with his subjective flight. A former analyst who asked colleagues to call him only by a nickname in later interviews told a quieter, more unsettling story. He claimed to have observed sessions where participants described the same curious figure, not detailed, but a presence, across different dates and different subjects. The figure's description varied in tone, but always carried a similar quality, an impression of attentiveness, as if someone, or something, was cataloguing phenomena. The analyst wrote in a closed memo, several subjects describe an entity of observation, not threat, not warmth, simply watching. Cross-reference with tall one, references in remote viewing archives. That memo, like several others, became heavily redacted when the file changed hands. There is also the famous gateway analysis itself, which reads like a careful bridge between the language of physics and the language of inner experience. The document explores hypotheses. Might certain states of consciousness allow perception that is not constrained by local sensory input? Could altered states connect to a broader informational field? Some authors reach toward metaphors from quantum mechanics, worlds where observation and measurement affect the system, to propose frameworks for how consciousness might interact with information beyond the immediate senses. They make cautious notes about the limits of analogy. They do not claim that consciousness collapses wave functions, but they do wonder whether our models of information and observation might need expansion when applied to mind states that produce repeatable anomalies. One particularly rich passage in the analysis considers time perception. Several participants reported sequences where time felt elastic, moments stretched like taffy, or minutes evaporated into hours. The analysts compared these reports with physiological data and sometimes found surprising mismatches. A person whose heart rate suggested a short session would later swear they had spent an hour wandering through a landscape. The Gateway report suggests that subjective time, when decoupled from ordinary sensory anchoring, can rearrange memory scaffolding. The document treats this idea with clinical calm, weighing its implications. If consciousness can access different temporal textures, what does that mean for intelligence operations that want to use such states to gather distant information? As with the Stargate files, the Gateway files are threaded by accounts that invite speculation without demanding certainty. The difference is in tone. Gateway tends to treat the phenomena with patience and methodical curiosity. It records, it compares, it wonders. The human testimonies, the moments where participants report contact, freezing mid-session, or seeing places they cannot otherwise know, are given weight insofar as they recur and align with measurable signals. One participant, a middle-aged woman with a background in the arts, described the most detailed inner journey recorded in the archive. She said that during a long session she found herself in a place she could not name, where the horizon was a band of soft, moving light. There she encountered beings who communicated not with words but with images that folded into each other. A rose opening to reveal a city, a clock unwinding into a field of stars. She returned from the session with tears on her cheeks and a calm that lasted for days. Her physiological record showed rhythms consistent with deep relaxation, but she insisted the emotional shift was profound and lasting. The analyst noted this as an instance where subjective benefit aligned with a stable, measurable state, an outcome they would later cite when discussing Gateway's potential applications for stress and resilience training. Yet the files also record moments where the boundary between study and unsettling surprise blurred. In one heavily redacted memo, an experimenter wrote that a participant had left marks on a sheet of equipment that were not there before the session. The redaction hides the details but not the implication. An object in the room bore an imprint or pattern that arrived inexplicably. When asked about such entries, a retired technician would only say with a small, strangely amused shrug, "Sometimes the oddest things happen in a quiet room." He would not elaborate further, but his tone suggested that the Gateway archive contains little mysteries the official pages rarely explained. What does all this mean for us now, in the low light of your room? The Gateway documents invite a gentle humility. They suggest that consciousness is not merely a passive watcher, but an active, malleable instrument that can be trained to perceive in ways beyond habit. They also suggest caution. When minds are coaxed into unfamiliar modes, strange phenomena can occur that challenge ordinary categories. The archive's measured curiosity and the participants' lived experiences together make a compelling case for ongoing inquiry. As you sink further into the quiet, imagine the echo of sound tapes designed to synchronize hemispheres, the slow drawing of breath, the soft click of recording equipment, and the shaped silence afterward when a participant opens their eyes and tries to find words. Let those images unfurl like smoke, soft and slow. Keep in mind that the gateway process is not an isolated oddity. In later chapters, we will see how its strands weave into other programs, into remote viewing that describes strange structures, into memos about entities encountered during altered states, and into the larger pattern of intelligence agencies reaching for the edges of human perception. There is a tiny promise tucked into these files that even in a world defined by instruments and measurement, there remains room for wonder. The Gateway analysts sought not mysticism but understanding. They approached mind states with careful tools, and in doing so they left behind something that feels like an invitation to consider that our inner lives may be deeper, stranger, and more connected than we often allow. Rest with that thought now. Let your breath slow. Let the image of soft sound and the corridor of light fade into the back of your mind like a pleasant distant music, carrying you gently deeper into sleep. Chapter 4. Operation. Often, occult research. The CIA tried to bury. Ease deeper now, let your shoulders drop, and follow my voice as we pass quietly through another locked corridor of classified work. This chapter moves into a corner of the archive where science met ritual, where instruments and incense shared the same room, a place that in some files is named with a deliberately mundane code, Operation Often. The official pages where they exist are spare. They catalogue meetings, budget line items, and procedural proposals that sound like any other bureaucratic document. Requests for small equipment purchases, contracts with outside consultants, and notes on experiment design. But read between the lines of those practical entries and you find another text, written in the margins of lab notebooks and in the hesitations of memos. You feel faintly the echo of rooms prepared for something the instruments wouldn't easily explain. Imagine entering one such room in the softest of lights. The air is warm and still. The floor, once covered in linoleum, now bears the dark outline of where chairs were repeatedly dragged for the same test. On a metal table sits an array of instruments, an EEG amplifier, a magnetometer, an oscilloscope, and curiously, a plate of objects assembled with deliberate randomness. A carved bone, a length of polished glass, a small copper bowl with faint green tarnish. The researchers called these cues. The proposal memos refer to them clinically, as variables to be introduced to a subject's field of attention. But the notes kept by one young research assistant, whose handwriting is still tender and looping, read differently. She wrote of the way a subject's hands would tremble when the bowl was placed into the centre of the room, and how the magnetometer would sometimes spike in a pattern that did not correspond to known electrical sources. Operation Often, as the internal conversation reveals, began as curiosity. In a few quiet briefings, intelligence officers discussed historical accounts of ritualized practices that seemed to produce effects: lights, sudden temperature changes, collective trance states, that were recorded by eyewitnesses for centuries. The question was not a mystical one, at least not at the start. Could patterned ritual, repeated gestures, sound frequencies, carefully timed cues, produce measurable physical effects that might be reliably induced? If so, could those effects be harnessed, or at least understood? The early experiments were modest. A small grant paid for a ritual chamber set up in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of base property. The design was rigorous in its own way. Repeated protocols, control groups, carefully logged timings. Subjects were screened and assigned to participate either in ritual sessions or in matched control sessions. All participants had sensors attached. Researchers watched for anything that would register on instruments: shifts in magnetic fields, anomalies in electromagnetic noise, unexplained thermal variants, or changes in the coherence of EEG rhythms. It is here the documents begin to fold into something stranger. On the official log, an entry in the late 1970s lists an unexpected electromagnetic pulse during a session with a 5-person group reciting a rhythmic chant. The entry is clinical: timestamp, equipment ID, amplitude of the anomaly. But the personal log of a senior technician, preserved in a box of papers and later smuggled out in photocopies, reads like a witness statement. He described the moment the monitors lit up, the hairs on his forearms standing at attention, and a silence in the room that felt substantive, like a held breath. He wrote that a photograph developed from thermal film that evening showed a faint vertical silhouette behind the participants, a dark column of cool space where no one stood. That photograph, he said, was removed from the file by a senior officer who told him with a steady voice that some pictures are better left in envelopes. Rumours grew around that missing photograph. Among lab technicians and a small circle of contracted anthropologists, a whispered story circulated that the image bore an outline resembling a human form but elongated, as if viewed through water. Those who saw it, even briefly, remembered the chill of recognition. Not terror, but the unsettling sense that a record had captured a threshold moment. Officially, there is no released photograph like that. Unofficially, the rumour sustained itself and attached a kind of mythology to the project. Operation Often's protocols evolved. The team experimented with sounds tuned to specific harmonic intervals, with candlelight patterns, and with ancient gesture sequences taken from ethnographic records. They tried to remove ceremony entirely and recreate the physical conditions with purely technological means: pulsed magnetic fields, patterned light displays, and infrasonic frequencies delivered through subsonic speakers. Some experiments produced nothing beyond normal noise. Others produced consistent, repeatable blips. A microphone that had been silent for an hour would record a faint, low-frequency rumble, coinciding with the end of a ritual sequence. A magnetometer would show a clean spike that could not be traced to any known equipment. A Kirlian photograph would show a brief, unexpected corona around a participant's hand. Listen to this carefully. The project did not present declarations. It catalogued anomalies and repeated tests to try to understand them. That practice, careful, methodical, quietly insistent, is the mark of science even within the strange. The team wrote memos arguing for more rigorous controls precisely because the phenomena sometimes appeared to respond to small changes in the protocol. A ritual gesture performed differently, a subtle change in cadence, and the anomaly would vanish. This sensitivity suggested that, if there was an effect, it was intimately tied to patterns, the temporal and structural features of human action, rather than to simple superstition. There is a story in the files of a consultant, an ethnomusicologist whose name is redacted but who left behind a set of taped interviews. She described teaching a small group a pattern of song and movement based on a rural tradition she had studied in the field. A simple chant, a 3-step pattern, and a hand gesture that closed the thumb over the forefinger. During the trial run in a sterile lab, nothing noticeable occurred. But when the same pattern was performed in a room furnished with certain objects from the tradition, earth, a small carved figure, and a bowl of salt, the instruments registered a clean, repeatable increase in low-frequency electromagnetic noise. The ethnomusicologist later remarked in a private note that context seemed crucial. Objects that carried meaning for the ritual tradition appeared to anchor whatever process the program had observed. One of the most compelling personal accounts comes from a security guard assigned to the facility during a late-night trial. He reported an episode in which, while making his rounds, he noticed the thermal cameras had a steady pattern that suddenly broke for a few seconds. On playback, he said, the camera showed a dark shape crossing behind a doorway, visible on infrared yet absent on ordinary film. The guard swore he saw nothing in the corridor with his own eyes. His written statement, which survived in the foyer cache with only a few redactions, ends with a line that reads like a small, honest wonder. I couldn't tell you what walked there, only that the cameras did. It's as if the room remembered something I could not see. Operation. Often also experimented with the psychology of belief. Some sessions deliberately frame the protocol as scientific, stripped of ceremony. Others invited participants to learn a traditional sequence, to imagine its meanings, and to place objects of personal significance into the ritual circle. The results suggested that belief and embodied familiarity mattered. When participants felt connected to the ritual through cultural or personal meaning, their physiological responses were often stronger and the anomalies occurred more consistently. This is a subtle and important point. The lab did not conclude that ritual was mere suggestion. Rather, it noted that humans carry patterns of attention and bodily memory that can interact with physical systems in non-obvious ways. Here is a quiet complication. At one point, a memo surfaced from a senior officer suggesting the team try to separate the performative elements from the structural elements, to isolate the motion, the rhythm, the object placement, and the acoustic signature. The memo advised using professional actors trained to enact the patterns without belief and comparing their sessions to those of cultural practitioners who carried the tradition in their bones. The results, in a summary never fully published, indicated that both groups sometimes produced similar instrument signatures, but that the cultural practitioners produced them more consistently and with greater amplitude. The analysts annotated this with a hypothesis. Cultural embodiment seems to act as an amplifier on whatever mechanism is at work. Now let us sit with another unsettling margin note found in a researcher's private diary. This is not an official file, but it persisted because several retirees remembered the anecdote. The researcher described a session where, after a particularly resonant chant, the EEG channels exhibited a pattern they could not reconcile with normal sleep stages. The waves formed a slow, rhythmic geometry across multiple participants, synchronized in phase for several seconds. The technician wrote that the air in the room felt colder, and that small beads of condensation formed on an instrument case. He drew a simple sketch of the waveform and annotated it. Coherent field, duration approximately 5 seconds, no external source. Later that week, the memo trail shows a request to destroy or reclassify certain raw data on the grounds of equipment contamination. The request was granted and executed. The possibility of recorded coherence across human brains remained archived and obscured. Operation often, too, intersected with other programs. An analyst who worked across project left a brief note linking certain ritual session transcripts with remote viewing logs from Stargate, and with gateway session notes describing entities watching participants. He posited a speculative model. Perhaps rituals and synchronized brain states create windows through which attention can align with phenomena not confined to local sensory input. This was not a settled conclusion. It was a thread of curiosity that moved quietly through the archives. Ethical complications accumulated. As the experiments grew more intriguing, internal counsel argued that the work approached dangerous territory. The files show memos cautioning about experiments that deliberately manipulated belief systems, about the psychological risk to participants, and about the diplomatic hazard of appearing to weaponize cultural practices, the project's defenders argued for continued research, claiming pragmatic benefits. If the phenomena were reproducible, they might offer new tools for de-escalation, for non-violent influence, or for understanding anomalous threats. The critics warned of the moral cost, and then, predictably, the paperwork shifts. Budgets are reduced, memos request consolidation of materials, and boxes are prepared for transfer to other departments. Some items are catalogued and reclassified, others vanish. The rumour of the missing photograph recurs, and with it the image of an officer sealing an envelope and sliding it into a safe with hands that do not quite tremble. A few participants were offered quiet compensation and confidentiality agreements. The last official status note reads like an administrative sigh. Project often operations to be suspended pending interagency review. But suspension did not mean forgetting. Years later, when FOIA requests pried into related programs, fragmentary materials surfaced, billing records for materials that had been used in ritual rooms, an offhand email referencing unexpected silhouettes in a test, a single photocopied diary page from a technician describing condensation on a metal box and the subsequent disappearance of the raw recording. Those fragments keep the story alive. As you lie quietly, let the precise, small imagery remain with you. The magnetometer's needle flicking, the humidity gathering, the low chant in a room lit by soft lamps. Consider also the patient, methodical tone of the researchers who wrote careful memos, and the nervous margins of technicians who recorded what they thought might be dismissed. Operation often is not a fairy tale. It is a case study in what happens when structured inquiry approaches practices once relegated to folklore. It is an archival space where belief, tradition, and instrumentation nudged against each other and sometimes produce measurable anomalies. There are further promises tucked in the archive, hints that later chapters will revisit, how ritual anchors may connect to reported non-human presences encountered in remote viewing, how time distortion notes resemble gateway testimonies, and how certain redactions cluster around a curious set of photographs that some claim show a silhouette not captured by visible light but recorded in thermal and electromagnetic spectra. Keep that in mind as we drift forward. There are images and memos still closed behind redaction bars, and an eventual chapter near the end will bring these threads together and show how one small censored photograph shaped a network of classification decisions. For now, let your breathing slow. Allow the room's quiet to become a cushion beneath your thoughts. Imagine the scanners dimming, the ritual instruments being gently set aside, the soft exhalation of a research team acknowledging they had touched something they could not yet explain. Hold that gentleness as we move on, an acceptance that our curiosity can be both bold and kind. Chapter 5. Project Artichoke. Early experiments in creating superhuman agents. Ease further into your bed now, and let the steady rhythm of your breath carry you forward. Tonight we move into an older, quieter chapter of institutional curiosity, a time when the edges between clinical research, clandestine experimentation, and strategic imagination were still being defined. This is Project Artichoke, the precursor to many later programs, the laboratory where ideas about enhanced agents, altered pain thresholds, and the possibility of trained loyalty were first sketched in blunt memos and then tested with caution, and sometimes with a kind of grim determination. Project Artichoke begins in the files that remain, like a slow tightening of a policy paper into an operational plan. There are meeting minutes with sober headings, behavior modification possibilities, hypnosis as interrogation adjunct, chemical modulation of stress response. There are budget requests for clinical supplies, contracts issued to university labs with good reputations, and diagrams of experimental rooms. But beneath the administrative language is a more human record: clinician notes, subject reports, and the small lines in the margins where a researcher paused and wrote something that reads less like protocol and more like astonishment. Imagine a small testing suite tucked behind a series of office doors, neutral walls, a recliner, a tray of instruments, wires neatly coiled like careful thoughts. Subjects were brought in for sessions meant to explore the limits of human endurance, to ask how steady a mind could remain when its inputs were altered, and whether resilience could be trained or manufactured. Hypnosis was one tool, pharmacology another. Behavioral conditioning and carefully timed sensory stimuli rounded out the methods. The official aim, as the documents say in their precise bureaucratic voice, was to develop techniques useful to intelligence operations. The lived reality is where the documents thin out and the stories get longer. One early clinic report, formal enough to have a stamp and informal enough to include a handwritten aside, recounts the testing of subjects for pain tolerance. The clinical notes describe a standardized procedure: controlled thermal exposure, graded pressure devices, and psychological scales to measure subjective discomfort. The surprising element in the margins came when a particular subject, after a sequence of interventions involving hypnosis and a mild pharmacological cocktail, exhibited pain thresholds far beyond the predicted curve. The clinician, who had expected modest increments, recorded instead a calm, almost unaffected demeanour as the tests progressed. She circled a line in the page and wrote, in a hand that tightened at the end. Subject remained conversational, engaged, and reported no distress. Physiological markers show normal autonomic response. Recommend replication. This is where the documents start to get quietly strange. In one packet, a redacted funding request asks for resources to explore enhanced pain-tolerant subjects, and suggests possible applications ranging from prolonged surveillance operations to field interrogation resilience. The language betrays a cold logic. If you can reduce the impact of pain, you could create operatives who withstand coercion or operate through conditions that would incapacitate others. The human cost of such a pursuit sits in the margins and in the testimonies that followed. A technician who later left the program told an interviewer that some subjects displayed behaviors that his training could not entirely explain. He described a man who, after a series of sessions, could remain awake and alert through conditions that normally induce blackout: noise, bright light, and sustained physical discomfort. He would talk, the technician said with a long exhale, about seeing his past like a screen and deciding to step away from it. It wasn't like he was pretending. It was like he'd been given a handhold out of panic. The technician's voice carried a mixture of respect and concern. That account appears in no official report, yet it circulated among colleagues as a quiet, ineffable lesson. These experiments did more than change behaviour on the surface. They shifted the internal story the subject carried about themselves. There are memos that suggest researchers were not just measuring pain thresholds, but attempting to modulate core motivational circuits. One heavily redacted note references induction protocols designed to alter fear responses and conditioning sequences to reinforce specified behaviours. The redactions are thick in places that might have named specific compounds or described particular stimulus patterns, but the shape of the proposal remains visible, a blend of suggestion, repetition, and pharmacology intended to produce durable changes. Another quietly disquieting thread concerns the use of hypnosis as a tool not only to access memory, but to install instruction. Early artichoke memos discuss post-hypnotic suggestion trials, where, after a guided trance, subjects carried out small tasks without recalling why. Clinical reports recorded a discrepancy. Some subjects would perform the instructed behaviour and yet have no conscious memory of receiving the instruction. The files present this as an intriguing cognitive separation, a potential operational advantage, but the personal narratives behind the notes give it a different weight. A subject recalled later, in a sealed testimony, waking one morning with a compulsion to walk to a particular bridge and sit for an hour. He could not explain why he felt compelled. He described the hour on the bridge as oddly calming and said he returned with a sense of an internal instruction completed. He found, weeks later, that small pieces of his routine had shifted in other ways too. Friends noticed he stopped smoking. He forgot certain jokes. He felt, in his private reflection, that part of his life had been gently rearranged. The project also flirted with ideas of enhanced cognition, not only resistance to pain and coercion, but improved focus, memory, and the ability to maintain clarity under stress. Some memos proposed training regimens combining rhythmic auditory stimuli, attention training, and carefully timed sleep cycles. The clinical trials mentioned small improvements in sustained attention tasks, and the files hint at an occasional subject who seemed to outperform control groups on complex tasks after a period of training. The implications are obvious. An operative who can keep attention steady for extended hours, remember fine details, and resist panic would be valuable. The ethics, however, remained muddied. In quieter, more troubling corners of the archive are references to anomalous subjects. Individuals who, even before experimental intervention, showed physiological readings that did not match norms. A log entry notes a subject whose ocular responses lagged behind auditory stimuli in ways the clinicians could not easily map. Another report lists a person whose galvanic response exhibited clean, stepwise changes instead of the usual jittery fluctuation. These anomalies appear in the files like small bright stones. They attracted attention, sometimes as curiosities, sometimes as potential nodes to be amplified. A redacted consult note hints at the possibility of non-standard biological substrates. A phrase appears partially visible, physiology atypical, followed by black ink. The silence around these entries fuels the fiction that certain experiments touched borders where human biology and something else met. The human stories return often. One operative in a later debriefing described a colleague who, after artichoke training, could maintain composure and capture scenarios that would break most people. The operative used careful, tempered words. It's not that he was without fear, it's that he could let fear pass through without letting it take the wheel. That kind of resilience, whether cultivated or discovered, left deep marks on relationships. Friends of trained subjects sometimes reported distance where once there had been warmth, a subtle emotional recalibration when an internal mechanism of survival had been altered. There are also darker rumours that thread through the program, whispered accounts of experiments where subjects reported hearing commands without sound, the same phrase resurfacing from MK Ultra fragments. One clinician's journal contains a line. A subject described internal words as though given from outside his head. He scratched the page until it bled. I cannot explain this. The clinician's entry fades into smudged ink. Whether these were side effects of substances, the result of suggestive techniques, or something else entirely cannot be conclusively stated from the documents available. Yet the repetition of the motif across files, the inner imperative, the voice that remains, unites Artichoke with the broader tapestry we have explored, a network of experiments attentive to the malleability of human intention. Project Artichoke also contemplated the moral and legal landscape. Internal memos debate the boundary lines. How far could the agency push before domestic law, ethical codes, and public trust were irreparably damaged? The minutes show people wrestling quietly with consequential questions. Some argued for restraint, others argued for continued exploration under strict oversight. The project's eventual dampening owed as much to bureaucratic caution and political scrutiny as to shifting priorities. But the archive suggests one enduring fact: the curiosity did not end, it evolved. Techniques developed in Artichoke reappeared in later projects with new names and new justifications. As you listen now, allow the chapter's long arc to settle like a soft blanket. Picture the careful, measured rooms, the clinicians taking notes, the quiet exhalations of technicians who'd seen more than their forms allowed them to report. Think of the human consequences, the subtle changes in habit, in memory, in the internal sense of agency, that make the project as much a story about people as it is about techniques. Before we close this chapter, a quiet invitation. Later chapters will bring into view how Artichoke's experiments connect to other projects we have already visited, how the subdued, conditioned resilience it sought mirrors the gateway practices of trained attention, how the reports of interior commands echo MKUltra testimonies, and how the notion of enhancing humans by reshaping inner life links to rumours of non-human physiology mentioned elsewhere. Keep that thread in mind as you drift further toward rest. Now breathe slowly. Feel the room cradle you. Allow the soft hush of the air and the slow cadence of your heart to guide you into the next quiet space. Chapter 6. Files on Psychokinesis, the CIA's search for real-world telekinesis. Breathe in slowly and let your shoulders melt down into the mattress. Let the air pass gently out of your lungs and follow my voice as we move into a quieter laboratory. A room lit by soft fluorescence, stacked folders, and the low, patient tick of instruments. Tonight we linger over a subject that has always lived between disbelief and fascination: psychokinesis, the possibility that mind can move matter. In the Cold War atmosphere of cautious curiosity, intelligence agencies quietly listened to reports, funded small studies, and sometimes watched very carefully for effects that would not be explained away by equipment noise or human error. The files that surfaced later show a methodical approach. Rather than dramatic pronouncements, the memos read like careful field notes. Descriptions of apparatus, lists of control procedures, and repeated attempts to remove every variable except the presence of a human mind. Investigators created tests designed to be unambiguous: sealed chambers, vibration-isolated tables, and instruments calibrated to detect the smallest shifts. The idea was simple and rigorous. If a person could produce a physical effect in a controlled environment, it should appear on instruments the way a heartbeat appears on a monitor. So they built conditions that left little room for accident. Picture one such test room. The door closes with a soft click. Inside, a bank of benches holds polished weights used for calibration, a set of metal spheres on frictionless bearings, and a microbalance capable of detecting mass changes smaller than a grain of sand. Cameras are positioned around the perimeter, recording at high frame rates. The walls are lined with acoustic foam to minimize external vibration. The subject sits in a comfortable chair, head slightly forward, hands resting on a cloth. A small microphone records breath and any vocalization. A separate recorder logs electrical noise on power lines. Two technicians sit behind a glass panel. Their faces calm, their notebooks open. Everything is set to reduce the world to measurable data. In several released memos, technicians recorded something unexpected: a slight, repeatable shift in metal calibration weights during a subject's quiet concentration. On the first attempts, the team shrugged. Perhaps thermal expansion. perhaps stray air currents. They tightened controls. The chamber became hermetic for brief intervals. The room temperature was regulated to a degree more commonly used in precision physics labs, and the balance was isolated from building vibrations. Still, on a small number of runs, the needle on the microbalance moved without any discernible mechanical cause. The movement was tiny, measured in micrograms, but it was consistent enough to demand attention. One technician, whose later interviews surfaced in a small documentary, and who still spoke about the incident with reverence rather than triumph, described the moment softly. He said the subject had been asked simply to intend a slight motion in the weight, to visualize a tiny nudge. For a long minute nothing happened. Then, with no audible sound and no change in recorded ambient conditions, the balance registered a step. The technicians checked the logs again and again. No signal from the HVAC system, no burst of electromagnetic noise, and no mechanical shock on the vibration sensor. On playback of the high-speed video, the metal object did not appear to move in any frame. The shift registered in the balance's reading rather than in visible translation, as if the effect altered the instrument's measurement rather than the object's position in a way the camera could easily capture. That detail, an effect on instrumentation without a clear visual correlate, became central to many of the program's internal debates. Some argued the change might be an artifact of electronic noise interacting with the electronics of the balance. Others argued that the consistency across different laboratories and different types of sensors warranted further study. The memos show these arguments unfolding with the calm deliberation of scientists who know how easy it is to be misled by noise. There are other, stranger entries in the files. A lab log notes a session where a technician recorded a sudden electromagnetic interference pulse at the exact moment a subject reported a sense of pressure in the room. Cameras recorded no visible movement, yet a nearby digital recorder briefly lost synchronization for a fraction of a second. The technician wrote, with a neatness that betrays a careful mind, that the pulse did not match any known power fluctuation. The entry ends with a recommendation to replicate the experiment with additional shielding and redundant recording systems. The recommendation was taken, and then, in some cases, those redundant systems also displayed brief, inexplicable anomalies, often when the subject's attention was most intense. A particular strand of anecdote recurs among retired analysts. Small, localized phenomena that seem to respond to directed attention. In one often retold account, a subject seated at a table with several metal calibration weights asked quietly if she might encourage one of them to tip. The room was sealed. The technicians recorded slowly, watching. The subject breathed deeply, and the weight on the right had a minute deflection, so small that several people in the room might have missed it had their eyes not been trained on the needle. When the experimenters checked the casing, they found no mechanical fault. Later analysis attempted to model whether thermal gradients could have created the deflection. The math did not support that possibility. The log was filed, annotated, and archived under a benign title. A copy of the photographs of the balance, later requested under FOIE, arrived redacted with several frames blacked out. The black bars in the release became, for some, a fertile source of rumour. What had been seen that someone wanted concealed? Witnesses sometimes described a tactile quality to successful moments. Several technicians, speaking off the record, recalled a sensation in the room like a subtle change in pressure, or the hair on their arms rising, as if the air had rearranged itself for an instant. A guard stationed outside the lab once told a colleague he felt as though the corridor had loosened around him for a breath. Whether these sensory impressions were psychosomatic responses to anticipation or indicators of something physical is exactly the sort of question the teams tried to pass. Beyond microbalances, The program experimented with different transduction systems to learn where effects, if any, showed up most reliably. Researchers used pendulums, RNGs, random number generators, and levitation plates. RNGs were compelling because they translate minute physical processes into streams of numbers. If an operator could bias the output of a truly random process, that deviation would show statistically in long runs. Files show teams running extended RNG sessions in shielded rooms, comparing baseline runs to those when a focused subject attempted to influence outcomes. In a handful of sessions, the deviation from randomness exceeded the expected statistical margin, prompting further tests. The memos emphasize caution, small sample sizes, possible electronics interference, and the ever-present risk of experimenter effects. A vivid story that circulated among researchers concerns a sealed box used for shielding experiments. The box contained a small metal vane mounted on a frictionless bearing and an array of sensors. On one night, a scheduled run showed the vane incrementally changing orientation during a subject's quiet concentration. Technicians replayed synchronized video and sensor logs. They found no mechanical trigger, and the vane's movement did not correspond to expected patterns of thermal drift. The head technician, a patient man who spent his career trying to remove ambiguity from data, later told a friend that the night felt like a soft negotiation between attention and the instruments. He would always say this with a smile and a slow, reflective tone, as if the memory was both scientifically intriguing and quietly ineffable. Not all the files point towards success. Many sessions produced null results. Many apparent anomalies evaporated under replication attempts. The recorded history in the memos is frank about frustration and the difficulty of separating signal from noise. The teams kept meticulous negative controls alongside their hopeful runs. That honesty is part of what makes the surviving records compelling. They do not present a tidy triumph. They present iterative study, caution, and a willingness to allow results to speak for themselves. There were also human consequences. Several participants reported psychological after-effects following intense sessions of directed attention. One woman described a lingering sensation that small objects near her had a faint, magnetic relationship to her hands, like a personal gravity she could not always turn off. She said it passed over days but left her wary. Clinicians documented similar accounts: transient changes in perception, altered proprioception in the minutes after a session, and vivid dreams. These are the quiet data of human experience, small aftershocks that did not translate cleanly into instrument logs, but mattered to the people involved. An image runs through the archive like a steady, curious refrain, the crossover between mind and machine. The files suggest that if psychokinetic effects existed at all, they did so at the margins and interacted with technological systems in ways we do not yet fully model. A plausible hypothesis developed by some within the teams was that directed attention could occasionally influence the microstates of sensors in ways analogous to observer effects in sensitive physical systems, not by violating conservation laws, but by nudging thresholds where detection electronics border thermal and quantum noise. That is a sober, nuanced way to conceive of a phenomenon that, in folklore, is often portrayed as dramatic movement of large objects. In these reports, the effects are small, precise, and maddeningly elusive, which makes them both scientifically interesting and difficult to weaponize. There are also threads that tie these psychokinesis folders to other parts of the classified puzzle. Analysts cross-reference sessions where psychokinetic anomalies occurred with remote viewing logs and gateway records that reported presences or fields in similar coordinates. In some cases, sessions that registered tiny instrumental disturbances also coincided with reports of watching sensations from remote viewers or with thermal anomalies in surveillance footage. Such patterns are suggestive, they are not proof, but they push some researchers to argue for integrated studies. Could altered states of attention, remote perception, and small physical anomalies be different expressions of a single underlying possibility? Those suggestions found their way into funding memos and into the occasional joint experiment where teams combined methods, remote viewers, hemisync audio, and microbalance arrays under the same roof. And then there are the files that never fully opened. Certain reports were reclassified, and some raw recordings were withheld. The pattern of what was released and what remained sealed fuels speculation. In the quiet of your room, consider the natural human tendency to complete a story when pieces are missing. The redactions do not prove any single spectacular claim. They simply keep a space of mystery open. For some, that space is terrifying. For others, it is the place where curiosity lives. As you drift deeper now, let the images soften. The patient hum of machines, the steady watch of technicians behind glass, a subject's calm breath as they send a tiny intention into the measured air. Think of the care with which the teams guarded their protocols and how, amid cautious skepticism, they sometimes recorded moments that resisted tidy explanation. Consider the gentle, persistent fact that science is, at its best, willing to look carefully at anomalies, to rule out error, and to let evidence, however small, steer inquiry. Tonight, psychokinesis in the archive reads less like a promise of grand feats and more like an invitation to humility. The documents ask us to entertain the possibility that attention, when concentrated and trained, can interact with sensitive systems at the edges of measurement. They do not shout conclusions, they whisper possibilities and leave room for future exploration. In later chapters, we will revisit how these small anomalies echo across other files as part of a pattern that includes remote viewing of non-terrestrial locations, surveillance records of shadows in secure facilities, and redactions clustered around moments when different instruments all behaved, briefly and strangely, at once. Let yourself rest with that soft, persistent curiosity. There's no need to force certainty. Allow the gentle ambiguity of the files to settle like dust motes in a shaft of late light, moving slowly and quietly as you breathe. Let the story cradle you as we prepare to move, in the next chapter, from human minds to the possibility of psychic explorers reaching off-world places and the accounts that suggest non-terrestrial impressions recorded before telescopes confirmed them. Chapter 7. Remote viewing of non-terrestrial locations. Sink deeper into the mattress now and let your breathing find a slow, steady rhythm. Picture a quiet room lit by an amber lamp, the sound of the world far away like a soft ocean. In this chapter, we travel beyond maps and charts, beyond satellites and telescopes, following the careful footsteps of trained minds that, with nothing but attention and method, reported seeing places far from Earth. The files on remote viewing of non-terrestrial locations are some of the most quietly astonishing in the archive, moments where human consciousness, trained and focused, seem to reach outward and return with images that later match discoveries made by instruments. Tonight we move through those accounts slowly, gently, and with the kind of patient curiosity that keeps a mind open while the body relaxes. The foundation of this work is simple in its intent. Can someone sitting in a small room thousands of miles from a distant planet describe features there with clarity and accuracy? The program's protocols were exacting. Remote viewers were given coordinates or target identifiers with no context. They practiced stabilizing attention, using protocols to reduce suggestion and expectation, and recorded every impression, shapes, textures, colours, sensations, as if sketching a memory. The transcripts that survive are a mixture of careful notes, redactions, and evocative imagery. Some entries read like technical logs, others read like fragments of dreams written in precise documentary language. The striking thing is how often the two registers, the scientific and the poetic, appear together. One of the best-known threads in the files concerns an early viewing session that would later be compared, with careful ceremony, to planetary data. A remote viewer named in later public discussions as Ingo Swan reported during a session, seeing bands and ringed structures around a planet. He described thin, radial spokes and an unexpected concentration of particulate matter, forming layered arcs. When those descriptions were later compared to data returned by telescopes and early spacecraft imaging, elements of his account matched features that were not fully appreciated at the time of the viewing. For many analysts, that correspondence was a quiet, thrilling confirmation that subjective observation had produced verifiable information. We move gently now through another kind of case. Sessions that recorded architectures and geometries foreign to terrestrial design. In heavily redacted transcripts, viewers described structures with non-Euclidean alignments, repeating modules that suggested purpose without obvious function, and surfaces that reflected light in ways unfamiliar to engineers. These descriptions, when appended to the sparse notes of analysts, formed a pattern. Repeated references to grids within grids, to solid forms that are not walls but membranes, and to arrangements that suggested intentional planning. One transcript includes a viewer's sketch of a place he called a plaza, beneath a sky that moves sideways, an image that, in its odd specificity, lodged in the minds of several project officers. A particularly haunting set of files concerns a viewer who, during a series of sessions, fixated on a distant target that analysts would later identify with a remote outcropping on a moon. The viewer's descriptions were layered. First, a sense of immense age, like a place that had weathered epochs. Then, a cluster of angular repeating forms, and finally, a strange low hum that he insisted he could feel rather than hear. When planetary imaging later revealed linear features in the target area, some officers felt the correspondence was more than coincidence. They noted the session's cadence, the way the viewer's confidence and detail increased through successive runs, and they placed the transcripts in a file flagged as correspondence worthy of follow-up. There are also the more unsettling accounts, viewers who said they encountered not landscapes but watchers. One viewer, in a document later found sealed in a rerouted folder, abruptly ended his transcript with a single line: "They are watching back." The transcriptionist circled the line and wrote, beneath it, "Subject discontinued participation. Consultant recommended psychological assessment." The notation has a calm, bureaucratic tone, but the content holds a quiet charge. In later interviews, colleagues reported that the viewer left the program shortly after that session, described as pale and withdrawn, and refused to talk about what he had seen. The image of something that can observe observers, not hostile, but certainly aware, threads through several documents and gives the archiver a persistent undertow of unease. Another pattern in these files is corroboration across independent viewers. In multiple, separate sessions, different viewers describe similar features at the same target: unexpected angularities, repeating nodes of light, and the pervasive impression of intentionality, arrangements that seem too deliberate to be natural rock formations. When several observers, working independently, reported such concordant details, analysts grew interested not only in the content of the impressions, but in the statistical weight of agreement. those agreements became a quiet impetus for allocating more time and resources to certain targets. A small number of transcripts include strictly procedural attempts to test the limits of the technique. In one experiment, an object of modern human manufacture was hidden inside a sealed container and placed on the surface of a remote target using robotic landers. Viewers were then asked to describe the object. In a handful of sessions, the basic qualities emerged: metallic surface, ridged form, a reflection pattern not unlike that noted in other remote descriptions. The project officers treated these results with measured excitement. The findings were not uniform and failure rates were high, but the positive instances were taken seriously precisely because they occurred under controlled conditions. We should pause and consider the redactions. Many transcripts are thick with black bars, excising coordinates, names, and sensitive context. Those redactions shaped how the files spread through the agency and into public view. Analysts often wrote explanatory notes in the margins, reminders to cross-check with imagery, to weight a viewer's confidence score, to consider environmental noise. The blacked-out fields contributed to rumour. What could be so sensitive that even a target's coordinate is withheld? For some within the program, the answer was practical classification. For others, the possibility that the viewers had perceived places or things that intersected with other classified operations. There are also accounts that gently blend the boundary between memory and metaphor. One viewer, describing a target beyond our system, spoke of geometries that did not care to be looked at. He wrote that attempts to focus on them produced a sensation of edges folding inward like the closing of a book. Scientists in the program annotated the passage and debated its meaning. Was it a metaphor for sensory limitation, an artifact of the viewer's expectations, or a description of a structure that actually behaved in ways incompatible with human perception? The debate was technical and calm, even when the content felt uncanny. Personal testimonies add a human layer. A program officer remembered returning home after reading a particularly strange transcript and sitting with a cup of tea in a small, dim kitchen, feeling the weight of the sentence. They watch and they catalogue. He told an interviewer decades later that the feeling of being catalogued, of consciousness entering a registry beyond human reach, was one of the archive's persistent motifs. He found himself wondering whether intelligence agencies had inadvertently stumbled upon a phenomenon that was not only informational, but relational. The act of perceiving elicited a kind of recognition across a distance. It is important, while we explore these quiet wonders, to note how carefully the officers attempted to validate reports. Correlation with later imagery, cross-viewer agreement, controlled tests, and statistical evaluation were all part of the program. The files show an agency trying to build a method out of phenomena that did not fit comfortably into existing frameworks. When positive correspondences occurred, they were flagged, annotated, and brought to the attention of analysts from other disciplines. When results failed to replicate, they were treated as data and fed back into the system for calibration. That persistent procedural rigor is what makes the compiled impressions credible within the archive's own standards. One of the more enduring and humanly poignant stories surrounds a viewer who, after repeatedly describing a complex, non-terrestrial structure, quit the program and later published a short poetic recollection under a pseudonym. He wrote of standing beneath an arc of stone that hummed faintly, feeling oddly at home and yet acutely aware of being far from anything he had known. He closed the piece with a single line: "I do not know if I was the intruder or the remembered." This sense of dislocation, the viewer unable to decide whether he had crossed a threshold into another's domain or found a memory that had always been there, is perhaps the most haunting element of the archive. As you breathe slowly now, imagine the hush of a viewing room. the scratch of a pen on paper as a viewer tries to map an uncharted vista, the quiet sigh of an analyst who crosses lines of data with images returned by a probe. Picture the archival folders, some neat and precise, others blotched with coffee and urgency. Consider the astonishing humility in the methodical approach, a desire to let the evidence, however subtle, suggest its own claims. Before we close this chapter, rest with a small, quiet note of anticipation. In later sections, we will revisit the moments when different methods, Gateway's hemispheric synchronization, Stargate's remote descriptions, Operation Often's anomalous photographs, and psychokinetic logs begin to whisper the same motifs, watching presences, non-human architectures, and repeating geometries that refuse simple categorization. These echoes are not proof on their own, but together they tilt the weight of the archive toward a portrait of something that invites further attention. Let that possibility float like a gentle lantern above your thoughts as they become slower and sleepier. There's no rush to resolve the mystery tonight. We are simply listening carefully to the document's quiet insistence that human perception, under certain conditions, has reached out and returned with images that sometimes, quietly, matched what later instruments would show. Chapter 8. Declassified UFO encounters the CIA quietly monitored. Ease your breath in and out now, let the rhythm slow, and imagine a vast cold sky stretched over a patchwork of military bases and quiet towns. In that sky, for decades, there were things that did not fit neatly into reports, memos, or scientific expectations. Tonight we turn our attention to the CIA's less often told role in tracking unidentified aerial phenomena, quiet monitoring, careful logging, and the kind of sober curiosity that lives in the spaces between headline drama and classified silence. The Cold War shaped the agency's priorities. Anything in the air had to be understood, categorized, and, where possible, neutralized as a strategic risk. A blinking light over a test range could be a weather balloon, or it could be a foreign craft. Over time, the CIA accepted that this practical vigilance required more than hurried notes. It required files, cross-agency coordination, and a habit of attention. So when pilots, radar operators, and ground observers reported encounters that even trained analysts found puzzling, those reports moved into a quiet, patient archive. Think of a typical night watch at an air defense sector. The radar console glow, the low murmur of voices, the coffee cooling beside a stack of theatre maps. A contact appears off the scope, a tight blip that accelerates, stops, or changes vector in ways the operators know do not match aircraft protocols. The first instinct is technical. Is this a sensor error, a folding of radar lobes? But repeatability matters. When visual observers on the ground corroborate a radar blip with a witness description, a craft moving without a sonic boom, glowing with colours not typical of engine exhaust, the file gains weight. The CIA's role, documented in scattered memos and later revealed in partial releases, was often to gather, cross-check, and assess such anomalies for their intelligence implications. There are several kinds of accounts that recur in the files. The first is the radar visual correlation. Independent instruments and human observers record anomalous trajectories at the same time. A notable illustrative case, reconstructed in redacted memos and corroborated by later interviews with retired personnel, involves an early evening flight in 1976 where a military pilot encountered an object that defied easy explanation. The pilot, operating under a pseudonym in official records, described approaching a target that caused his instruments to lock on and then fail in stages. His altimeter blinked, his radio chatter faded, and the aircraft's electrical panel showed anomalies. For a few tense seconds, every system that should have provided situational awareness faltered. Then, just as abruptly, the instruments returned to normal, and the object accelerated away with an instantaneousness that left no sonic trace. The pilot landed, his hands still trembling, and wrote a formal report that moved through channels to a file later marked for the attention of an intelligence desk. Technicians who later examined parts of the incident log noted something unusual. The radar track showed a spike in velocity that could not be accounted for by known propulsion profiles. Air traffic controllers who watched the display described a dot that shimmered, then leapt across the screen in a way that suggested a non-linear change in position. The CIA analysts annotated the report with calm, professional questions. Instrument fidelity, potential foreign technology tests, atmospheric ducting, and the possibility of electrostatic or plasma effects on sensors. They tested each hypothesis in their internal reviews, and in several cases the technical explanations did not fully resolve the anomalies. Another class of files conveys the electromagnetic interference frequently associated with some encounters. In numerous incident logs, pilots reported that while tracking an unknown object, the avionics experienced partial or total failure. Headsets would go mute, navigation beacons would drop out, the autopilot would disengage. These events are recorded with a technician's precision. Timestamps, system error codes, and subsequent maintenance logs showing no mechanical faults. One busy maintenance chief later told an interviewer, quietly, with a careful voice, that he had worked on aircraft after unusual encounters and found no reason in the hardware to explain the prior electrical glitches. The systems were fine, he told the interviewer, but the logs told a different story. They had gone dark in a way that suggested an external influence. The CIA, vested in national security, traced patterns. Certain encounters clustered near sensitive sites, while others occurred over open water or remote deserts, far from obvious strategic value. Visual descriptions supply emotional texture to the dry technical notes. Eyewitnesses, pilots, ground observers, and even civilians caught on evening walks described crafts that moved with an economy of motion unfamiliar to conventional flight, stops that would seem physically impossible, accelerations that implied thrust far beyond known limits, and angles of approach that ignored the aerodynamic principles taught in flight schools. A farmer in a Midwestern county wrote in a handwritten note archived among a cache of civilian reports that a craft hovered silently over his field and then folded away like a card being flipped, leaving a faint shimmering residue in the air. His note, though informal, was catalogued because it aligned with a simultaneous radar blip. The CIA's analysts were careful. They catalogued the witness's credibility, cross-checked with local weather patterns, and weighed alternative explanations. This methodical triangle, instrument, observer, environment, is how the agency tried to move from anecdote to assessment. We should pause on a kind of account that sits at the edge of official discussion. Pilots citing narratives that report objects displaying behavior reminiscent of instantaneous acceleration. These stories, recounted by multiple aviators over decades, share common elements. A smooth, unhurried approach by the aviator, a sudden change in the object's velocity or altitude, and an absence of sonic bang, heat signature, or expected turbulence. Several pilots later described a sensation of something like a tug on the instincts rather than the controls, an urge to move away that was more psychological than mechanical. In follow-up interviews, some pilots spoke of a mild disorientation that passed quickly, while others reported profound changes in their professional comfort with the sky, a tremor of uncertainty about what else might be out there beyond known technology. The files also carry instances of surveillance camera footage and thermal images, sometimes heavily redacted, that presented oddities. Infrared footage captured heat signatures that did not comport with the shape the visible light camera recorded. In some thermal frames, a distinct cold spot appeared when no object was present in optical recordings. Technicians annotated these frames, recommending more controlled testing. The CIA's records show a steady pattern. Where visual and infrared records diverged, analysts pursued sensor cross-calibration. Where they aligned yet showed impossible motion, they raised questions and sought corroboration from allied agencies. One of the more affecting patterns in the archived material is the response of local communities. In many of these files, a small town's collective memory makes its way into the bureaucratic record. Families who recall nights of unusual lights, townspeople who say cattle behaved oddly, and churches that reported parishioners gathering in parking lots to watch slow, luminous objects glide overhead. The CIA recognized that sociological data mattered. Widespread community reports did not prove alien visitation, but they provided a social signal of sustained phenomena that required cross-disciplinary review. Of course, skeptics found explanations in sensor error, celestial objects, secret test flights, and meteorological events. The CIA's own analysts favored rigorous skepticism. Many anomaly reports received plausible conventional explanations after exhaustive review: misidentified aircraft, rare plasma events, or instrument artifacts. But a subset resisted tidy resolution. These were the files that earned extra margins and quiet footnotes, the ones whose coordinates and witness lists later received redactions when shared under interagency agreements. The pattern of what remained ambiguous and what was rationally explained shaped a core tension in the archives: how to balance institutional rigor with the genuine possibility of phenomena that did not map onto existing technology. There are also files hinting at interagency caution, internal memos suggesting that public disclosure of certain incidents would create panic, espionage risk, or diplomatic friction. In the archives, we find notes recommending that some material be held close to the vest, not for concealment out of fear, but for the slow, careful process of technical assessment. Those memos show a bureaucracy trying to weigh national security against transparency. The result was a patchwork of released documents and sealed files, which in turn fueled rumour and speculation. Now listen to a quieter, more personal kind of entry: a pilot's logbook notation later uploaded as part of a FOIA release, where a young aviator wrote with a careful hand about a night interceptor mission. He noted how, as he closed to investigate a faint target, his instruments blurred and then regained clarity in a pattern he could not explain. He scribbled the words, "Instruments locked, but no impact on controls," underlining them twice. That small line became the seed of a much longer inquiry. The CIA, for its part, recorded the entry, cross-checked radar logs, and then carried the report into an analytical folder tagged for further study. Embedded in many of these pages are the human after effects. Witnesses sometimes reported changes in sleep, unusual dreams, or a lingering unease with routine nighttime flights. A retired Air Force mechanic admitted in a quiet later interview that after servicing an aircraft involved in an unusual encounter, he dreamed for months of blue light and clean geometry. These psychological ripples, the private, hard-to-quantify human consequences, entered the archive as anecdotal appendices and later as data points in wellness reviews of personnel. The CIA's role, as revealed by the mosaic of memos, was not simply to sensationalize or to dismiss, but to gather and assess. Analysts assembled dossiers, compared radar traces, and asked pointed technical questions. They modeled the data against known physical principles and documented when phenomena exceeded the explanatory power of conventional apparatus. In multiple instances, they recommended cooperation with scientific experts, universities, and allied agencies. Where correlations persisted, especially when radar, optical, and witness reports aligned, the files move from routine to exceptional, from daily log to a case file needing cross-disciplinary attention. Before we move on, rest with a quiet, thoughtful insight. The archive's most compelling feature is not a single, undeniable document proving the extraordinary. It is instead a constellation of small, stubborn anomalies that resist easy categorization, and that, when gathered together, create a pattern of interesting unknowns. The CIA's quiet role in watching the skies is a portrait of institutional humility, a recognition that the world sometimes presents data that do not fit current models, and that careful, methodical attention is the wisest first response. As you drift now, feel the night press gently around your thoughts. Consider how the documents we've reviewed tonight link to other chapters you've already heard. Remote viewers reporting presences beyond our skies, gateway sessions noting distortions of time, and surveillance records catching dark shapes inside secure facilities. These threads will reappear, braided together as we continue. There is comfort in this methodical curiosity. The archive does not demand you believe at once. It invites you to listen, to weigh, and to let the possibilities unfold. Chapter 9. The Mysterious Entity Contact Memos. Breathe slowly now, deeper than before, and let your body become a soft, steady weight on the mattress. As you settle, imagine an archive room that is almost entirely ordinary. Metal shelving, stacks of manila folders, fluorescent light that hums like a long, low note. Tucked between technical reports and budget spreadsheets, there is a slender set of memos that do not read like policy or procurement. They read like the residue of people who had for a moment encountered something that languages of bureaucracy did not easily hold. Tonight we open those memos and move through them with care. These documents are small in number but large in implication. They are not dramatic proclamations. There are no sweeping claims printed in bold. Instead, they are terse field notes, brief cables, and half-typed evaluations that point toward a recurring theme. Encounters with presences, figures, or impressions that several independent witnesses described in similar quiet ways. The memos were often routed to psychological consultants and internal review boards because they disturbed established categories. We will walk through them gently, pausing at the human lines that give these dry pages their quiet intensity. The first memo we come to is stamped with a date and a careful handwriting. It summarizes a series of remote viewing sessions where two separate viewers, from different cohorts and different years, use similar language to describe an apparent intelligence they both called in later interviews the Tall One. The memo's tone is clinical. Session IDs, confidence scores, cross-references, but tucked into the middle is a short italicized note from an analyst who had handled both transcripts. He wrote, "Independent concordance on descriptive motif, unusual. Recommend consult with gateway analysts." That italic line became the first hinge in a slow chain of cross-project curiosity. We turn the page and find a field report from a security officer at a remote facility. He describes a patrol where his thermal cameras registered a figure moving just beyond the perimeter, a dark, elongated silhouette visible only in infrared. The guard reported no corresponding visible light evidence and no sensor triggers. He filed a succinct statement. Infrared shows humanoid silhouette, no RF signature, no access detected. Occurred 1:43 local. He signed with his initials and added quietly, "I have never seen anything like it." That phrase is simple, human, and anchors the memo to lived apprehension rather than technical abstraction. Another memo reads like a clinical note from a psychologist, assigned to evaluate an intelligence analyst who had spent months in gateway-style training. The analyst reported recurring impressions of others during projection sessions, not hostile, but curious and at times communicative. The psychologist recorded the analyst's description with clinical steadiness. Subject reports intermittent perception of a largely vertical figure, usually at the spatial periphery of session imagery. Reports no explicit verbal exchange. Impressions consisted of emotion and an array of shifting images consistent across 2 separate sessions. The memo ends with a recommendation for further observation, as though the writer could not quite resolve whether the reports were suggestive artifacts of training or evidence of something more. Small threads run between these memos. In one heavily redacted cable, an analyst circled a phrase found in 3 separate testimonies, a cataloguing impression, the sense that something in the observed field was noting details about the viewers or the environment. The word is clinical, almost neuter, but its implication ripples. What would it mean for a non-human intelligence to be cataloguing observers? The memos do not declare a conclusion. They do not say the agency had proof. Instead, they show the institution performing the work it does best, collecting data, cross-referencing, and asking the right cautious questions. Interwoven with the memos are eyewitness accounts that read like short stories folded into a bureaucratic file. A retired linguist contracted as a consultant once wrote, in a candid addendum to a memo, that 2 independent sources use similar metaphors when attempting to describe an entity. One spoke of a presence like a doorway, another of a silence that had shape. The linguist suggested studying the metaphors themselves as data points, because repeated metaphor across social and personal backgrounds could indicate that the phenomenon had certain consistent features in subjective experience. This textual sensitivity is telling. It shows a human attempt to map the unmappable by paying attention to how people speak when they lack technical vocabulary. One particularly affecting account came from an intelligence analyst who had participated in combined experiments, gateway hemi-sync protocols followed by remote viewing exercises. In his sealed statement, he described a session where, after achieving a deep, synchronized state, he perceived a tall figure at the room's edge that seemed to tilt its head in a way he later read as attention. He said the figure did not communicate via voice, but conveyed a sequence of images that felt like small, clean notes of information. A map fragment, a curved surface, a sensation of age like the smell of dust after a wind. What is notable in the memo is not just the content but the analyst's tone. He is both precise and awed, recording sensory impressions with the same care he would use to mark anomalies on a radar screen. The bureaucratic habit of translating subjective data into operational observations is alive in these pages. We find in the files a short exchange between a program lead and a senior legal counsel. The lead asks whether any protocol exists for handling reports of apparent intelligent contact. The counsel replies with a measured paragraph that reduces to a single operational caution. Treat as psychological data, maintain chain of custody, and avoid speculative dissemination. This note reveals institutional prudence, an attempt to observe without inflaming, but also reveals attention. When something in the archive begins to space beyond ordinary categories, how does an organization of instruments and rules respond? Stories circle like small moons around these memos. One rumor preserved in oral histories speaks of a now anonymous viewer who, after a session, drew an image not unlike a simplified, elongated human silhouette with an unusual pattern across its chest, a motif later reported in a separate remote viewing session by a person who had never met the first viewer. Officers who saw the images recalled a quiet, charged moment of recognition. The images were placed in a folder labelled with a neutral title and then received extra layers of review. Whether the matching imagery signified a shared archetype, experimental contamination, or something else entirely remains undetermined in the files, but the coincidence invited more cross-method investigation. Another memorandum details a case where the pattern of reports shifted the way analysts structured their questions. After several participants described a seemingly attentive presencing during out-of-body states, a sense of being observed by something that did not belong to human social categories, program officers initiated controlled experiments aimed at measuring whether the apparent contact correlated with specific environmental signatures. They synchronized EEG arrays, thermal imagers, electromagnetic sensors, and high-fidelity audio in attempts to detect any physical correlate to the encounters. The resulting logs were dense with instrumentation data, and in a few sessions, technicians recorded transient anomalies coinciding with subjective reports. A microsecond pulse in an electromagnetic sensor, a brief dip in room temperature captured by a thermal probe, or a tiny coherence in EEG patterns across participants. The memos carefully annotated these correlations, always reminding readers that statistical rigor was necessary and that coincidences must be treated skeptically. Yet the pattern of co-occurring subjective reports and instrument blips, when repeated, pushed the team to ask more searching questions. There are also candid human notes about aftermath. Some participants, after their reported contacts, experienced a change in their sense of self, an altered cadence in speech, a new quiet, or an altered way of noticing details in the world. A clinical memo recorded that one participant reported dreams of corridors and figures cataloguing objects. Another reported feeling a residual sense of being measured like a specimen. Clinicians debated whether these effects were harm, adaptation, or merely the psychological price of contact. Ethically, the memos demonstrate unease and solicitude. Practically, they show a program attempting to care for its human assets, even while it followed stubborn curiosities. Toward the end of this cluster of files sits a short, almost elegiac note from a project officer who resigned shortly after a set of sessions. He wrote that after months of reading transcripts and reviewing instruments, he could not conclude definitively what the occurrences meant. He described in precise and gentle prose a new humility. "We had become students in a classroom not of our design," he wrote, "and the lessons were never direct." His letter requested that the materials be preserved and that future researchers be given the same careful protections that allowed the team to document without hysteria. That officer's tone, calm and earnest, is one of the archive's persistent human voices. What do these memos imply? They do not in themselves prove any sweeping claim. They do not assert contact in a way that would satisfy a courtroom. But they capture a pattern of independent testimonies, instrument correlations, and a sustained institutional practice. Attentive documentation, skeptical cross-checking, and a willingness to pursue anomalies that resist tidy explanations. There is a remarkable restraint in the files, an effort to hold the line between curiosity and credulity, while still honouring the lived reports of people who had been moved by their encounters. As you listen now, let the quiet of these memos become a kind of comfort. There is beauty in careful record-keeping, in the patient labour of people trying to convert mystery into data, so that others may study it without panic or ridicule. Imagine the folders slid gently back into their shelves, the lights dimmed, and the archive breathing under a steady hush. Hold in your mind the image of a cautious institution learning, slowly and modestly, to respect the possibility that consciousness reaches further than we presumed. Keep this thread as a soft ember within your awareness, because in the coming chapters we will revisit places where the memos overlap with surveillance footage, where the tall silent impressions echo the tall one motif, and where different instruments briefly sing the same strange tune. There is an unfolding logic here, not a single thunderous proof, but a gradual accrual of converging notes that together feel like a quiet invitation to keep paying attention. Chapter 10: Time Distortion. Experiments hidden inside parapsychology files. Let your breath fall into a slow, even rhythm and allow your body to weight into the mattress. Picture a dim lab corridor lined with filing cabinets and soft-footed technicians moving between rooms. The light here is careful and low, the equipment quietly humming as if preserving a conversation between machines and slow thought. Tonight we turn to a topic that bends familiar measures: time. In the quiet corners of the archive, between EEG readouts and hemisync tapes, there are records of experiments that explored not just perception, but the very texture of time. How minutes can stretch into years in a sentence. How an hour can fold into an impossible instant. How memory itself can be rearranged into new temporal tapestries. This chapter slowly opens those records and follows their soft, strange logic. The files begin in a practical voice. Researchers wanted to know how altered states affected temporal perception, because time is the frame through which intelligence operations are planned. If an operator's internal clock could be expanded or contracted at will, if memory of a moment could be extended to include far more detail, the strategic implications seemed clear. That utilitarian prompt, a straightforward question dressed in lab coats, led to patient, careful experiments. Scientists applied the same methods used elsewhere: control groups, blind protocols, synchronized instrumentation, and the attempt to remove as many confounds as possible. What emerged from their notes is a layered set of observations, some scientific and replicable, some stubbornly anomalous, many deeply human. One early protocol placed subjects in a tightly controlled environment and asked them simply to count seconds aloud while their physiological rhythms were recorded. At first glance, the results were mundane. Some participants overestimated durations, others underestimated them, and most errors fell into predictable psychological patterns. But in a few sessions, self-report and instruments pulled away from one another in ways that would trouble the experimenters. A subject might describe a sensation of wandering through hours of internal imagery, while the video timestamp recorded only a few minutes had elapsed. The clinicians, used to voyeuristic descriptions of dreams, nevertheless paused. The mismatch was not just subjective. It appeared to leave traces in correlated physiological markers that suggested sustained cognitive processing beyond what the wall clock allowed. One repeated and haunting notation in the experimental logs reads like this: session subjective duration, approximately 1 hour. Objective duration, 7 minutes. Post-session checks show participant-created physical marks on instrument housing not present before entry. The line is clinical, a tidy record of paradox, but the details around it, handwritten follow-ups, a memo requesting tape audits, photocopied therapist notes, animated. The image of someone returning from a short bracketed experiment and finding traces they could not have left within that objective interval produces a soft, unsettling curiosity. The researchers experimented with combinations of methods to modulate experience: guided hemisync audio sequences, meditative induction scripts, intermittent sensory deprivation, and controlled breathing patterns. In some runs, they layered these techniques with remote viewing protocols and psychokinetic intent, a braided approach that sought to see whether altered attention could produce consistent temporal anomalies. The files document gradual sophistication, better shielding for audio cues, higher fidelity timecode generation, and synchronized clocks across rooms to ensure any discrepancy was not an artifact of poor instrumentation. The teams were conservative and methodical. They resisted the impulse to dramatize. Their notes read like a map of a slow, exacting labor. There are several case reports in the files that recur in oral histories and in the quieter, unredacted margins. One such case involves an analyst who volunteered for a long hemisync session late at night. The recorded tape shows a routine induction, a 30-minute program. The clinical log states 30 minutes. But when the analyst emerged, he held in his hand a small, neat sketch he said he'd drawn during the session, a detailed floor plan of a building that, as far as he could recall, he had never seen. He described, with a calm voice, the astonishment of realizing the drawing was filled with precise room numbers and an unusual stairwell pattern. Later, when the diagram was compared to a different file's redacted layout, certain features aligned. The lab memos that documented the comparison are careful, cross-correlation unknown, degrees of confidence tentative, further study warranted. What stayed with the researchers was not a single isolated coincidence, but the specificity of a subjective hour that seemed to contain more than the clock allowed. A different thread concerns tape recordings and time signatures. In several archived sessions, technicians noted anomalies in recorded media, tapes labelled for one duration that, when digitized later, presented stretches where the audio ran twice as long as the wall clock indicated. On inspection, the recording equipment logs showed contiguous files with no evidence of physical splicing or manufacturing defect. One engineer wrote a note in the margin. Playback appears normal on device, but timestamp discrepancy persists when cross-checked. Possible time-based drift? No. Oscillator calibration checked. The sentence grows anxious and careful, as if the writer gently tried to push something unknowable back into the language of instrument error. The occasional, inexplicable discrepancy led teams to tighten controls, redundant timecode, independent atomic clock references, multiple simultaneous recordings, but the anomalies sometimes continued, stubborn and small. Human testimony gives texture to those small, stubborn anomalies. A subject who later wrote a sealed testimony described a session where minutes of induced attention felt like a slow thread of experience stretching and folding into itself. During the session, he says, he continued to live a narrative, moving through rooms, naming details, cataloguing features that later matched micro details found on photographs from an unrelated project file. He signed the testimony with a tone of quiet bewilderment. I remember thinking I had many hours inside my head, and then the lights came on and everyone told me it had been 10 minutes. For the clinicians reading such accounts, the question was not only whether subjective time had dilated, but how that dilation might interact with memory encoding and the translation of subjective content into later, verifiable data. The files show experiments designed to test whether time dilation in subjective experience could be harnessed for operational advantage. Could a trainee, who subjectively sampled a longer stretch of detail within a short objective interval, extract more information from a target? Would a surveillance operative trained to experience elongated observation be better at noticing and retaining vital cues? These are pragmatic questions, and the documents approach them with the measured language of trial design. The proposals are precise. One group performs a standard observation task for 10 minutes. Another group uses induction protocols and reports on perceived duration and detail recall. The outcomes were mixed. Some inditions produced greater subjective recall and finer-grained descriptions of observed scenes. Others produced memory distortions that blended imagination and observation. The balance was delicate. A longer feeling hour could yield richer data, but it could also fold fantasy into fact if not carefully constrained. A set of memos from a senior analyst worried over the ethical dimension. If subjective time could be altered, how might that affect consent, psychological stability, and operational reliability? The analyst's handwriting tightens in the marginalia. If we expand inner duration, are we subjecting participants to prolonged subjective stress even if their bodies are physically only briefly engaged? Must we measure subjective load as much as objective time? Those questions forced a recalibration of protocols. Safeguards were added, post-session integration interviews, extended psychological monitoring, and a policy that limited the subjective, lengthening sessions to volunteers who had demonstrated strong emotional resilience. Some of the files edge into the more speculative motifs that cross other projects. There are redacted cross-references to remote viewing logs where viewers reported clockless landscapes, places where time did not appear to move linearly, where seasonal layers stacked like transparent pages. Analysts annotated these cross-refs and hypothesized that certain target types correlated with subjective reports of elongation or contraction. In one speculative memo, an officer wrote, "Targets with non-linear temporal markers, e.g., strata overlapped, correlate with higher subjective elongation scores, suggest integrated study with Gateway and Stargate teams." That collaborative curiosity, threaded through the archive, is a hallmark of why these experiments mattered. They were not isolated curiosities, but part of a network of inquiries probing the malleable edges of perception. The human consequences are gently recorded and sobering. Several participants experienced lingering effects, dreams where an entire life had unfolded in an instant, or the odd sensation that a day had lost a veneer of continuity. Clinicians documented patient narratives where an hour-long subjective session recurred in memory as a lifetime, replete with relationships and choices that never had physical reality. These after-effects were rare but consequential, and they sparked debates about the responsibility of curiosity. The archives show memos forwarding participants to counselling, and colleagues arguing about whether such subjective expansion was ethical without deeper safeguards. There are also the small cinematic anomalies that make the story linger in the mind. A lab tech remembers a night when the recording displayed a short pause, as though the tape had been held in the breath between beats, and when it resumed, the subject reported a sequence of observations that the video then corroborated in micro-detail. The tech wrote later, "It felt like the world folded and stitched itself back together with a few new threads. The language is quiet, almost poetic, and the account passed between colleagues like a shared secret." As we breathe together now, consider the slow patience of the archive. The investigators did not race towards showy pronouncements. They tightened protocols, added redundancies, and listened with disciplined curiosity. The time distortion files do not claim a dramatic cinematic manipulation of hours and days, but they do document subtle, repeatable anomalies where subjective duration and instrument records diverged. They reveal a field in which the inner life and objective measurement do not simply sit in parallel. Sometimes they entwine, offering glimpses of possibilities that ask for continued study rather than reckless declaration, a quiet note of anticipation. In later chapters, we will return to instances where time anomalies intersect with other strange indicators, where psychokinetic blips and thermal camera oddities align with reported elongations of subjective experience, where a remote viewer's sense of being watched lines up with a surveillance file showing unexpected timestamps. The archive has a patient, accumulating logic. Single oddities are interesting. Clusters of correlated anomalies become compelling. Now, as you allow these images to soften, let time itself feel gentle. There is no rush to knowledge, no pressure to resolve the mysteries tonight. Let your breath mark the steady beat of the present. Imagine minutes folding down like soft pages, each one quiet and safe. Let your mind drift with that soft geometry and allow sleep to carry you forward into the next chapter of our slow investigation. Chapter 11. The surveillance records of unidentified shadows in secure facilities. Long before the public heard the term UAP, before military pilots released cockpit footage, and before congressional hearings whispered about non-human biologics, the CIA had been quietly documenting encounters that didn't fit any category. Encounters that didn't involve flying craft at all, but things that appeared inside some of the most secure, heavily monitored government buildings in the United States. These strange intrusions were never meant to be discussed or even acknowledged beyond a handful of analysts. They were catalogued simply as shadow incidents, a deliberately vague designation that suggested a lighting glitch or a sensor malfunction, even though the agents who worked those cases insisted there was nothing accidental about what they saw. The existence of the surveillance logs was only hinted at in a handful of declassified reports, buried under jargon-heavy descriptions of sensor calibration issues. But the internal memos, those that were never meant to be read by anyone outside certain restricted divisions, painted a far more disturbing picture. They described humanoid silhouettes that appeared on thermal cameras, tall and unnaturally thin, their outlines distorted as though their bodies were absorbing heat rather than emitting it. Yet, when cross-referenced with the standard security cameras covering the same hallways, there was absolutely nothing there. No figure, no movement, no disturbance of shadows, just empty halls. The first recorded shadow incident took place at a secure facility in Nevada, often misidentified in rumours as part of Area 51, but, according to internal documents, was actually located several miles away in an underground structure designed to store materials classified above top secret. A guard named Leland Brooks, a former Air Force security officer with a flawless record, submitted a report that his supervisors initially interpreted as a stress-induced hallucination. According to Brooks, he'd been walking his usual patrol route when he felt what he called air displacement, a sudden pressure shift, as though someone had walked past him very quickly. He turned his head, expecting to see a coworker or maybe a technician who'd lost track of time, but the hallway was empty. What unsettled him wasn't just the feeling of presence, but the fact that his proximity alarm, worn on every guard's uniform, hadn't triggered. These alarms were designed to sense movement within a specific radius, even small animals. But Brooks's device remained silent. Later, when he reviewed the thermal footage with his supervisor, they saw a shape, tall, narrow humanoid, glide down the hallway, passing within inches of Brooks. The shape had no face, no visible features, and its arms hung longer than a human should. It moved with a strange fluidity, as though gravity affected it differently. The moment it passed Brooks, the temperature in that area dropped by nearly 9 degrees, yet on the standard video recordings, Brooks was entirely alone. This was not the last incident, nor the most unsettling. Within months, similar silhouettes appeared in facilities across Virginia, Colorado, and even in a seemingly unremarkable administration building in Maryland that wasn't supposed to house anything sensitive. The creatures, if creature was even the right word, never interacted directly with personnel. They never attempted communication, never made physical contact, and never stayed long. They would appear for a matter of seconds, glide through walls as though those walls were mere projections, and vanish. The lack of physical impact made them even harder to explain. Security doors with airlock-level seals remained untouched. Pressure sensors showed no change. Laser trip systems did not register movement. It was as if these things existed halfway into reality, able to influence one form of detection but not another. One analyst proposed that the figures were distortions caused by temperature anomalies from failing cooling systems. But that theory collapsed when the incidents increased during winter months and clustered specifically around classified storage vaults. A series of confidential briefings eventually suggested that the shadows might not be intruders in the traditional sense, but rather interdimensional bleed-throughs, echoes of entities not fully present in our physical world. The theory gained traction after a particularly disturbing incident at a Colorado high-security laboratory. 2 analysts reviewing thermal recordings saw not 1, but 3 silhouettes standing motionless around a vault containing classified biological materials. They were not doing anything, just standing, as though observing or waiting. The figures remained in place for nearly 30 seconds before fading away. One analyst reported later that the sight made him physically ill, not because of what he saw, but because he felt, inexplicably, that the figures were aware of him watching, despite the footage being decades old by the time he reviewed it. A separate memo described a case where 2 guards stationed in a sub-level storage wing heard what they described as faint whispering, though it was not in any language they recognized. The audio surveillance captured nothing, not the whispers, not any environmental noise that would explain the sensation of voices. One guard fainted from sudden dizziness, and the other reported feeling as if someone was standing directly behind me, breathing down my neck. The thermal cameras showed a shadow-like figure inches from him, unmoving, as if observing his reaction, though again, no conventional camera saw anything at all. To avoid panic, the CIA quietly reclassified these occurrences under harmless-sounding categories like thermal interference anomalies, and most personnel were never informed of what was actually being recorded. Only a handful of analysts within a highly restricted unit had access to the full reports. Some believed the shadows were connected to earlier CIA experiments involving consciousness expansion, remote viewing, and dimensional studies. Others argued they were unrelated anomalies, possibly natural phenomena that humanity simply didn't have the tools to understand. But a small group, those assigned to the classified archival summaries, believed the shadows were something else. Manifestations of entities that were already here, beings that could move through secured areas not by breaking in, but by slipping through from a dimension parallel to ours. The most unnerving conclusion came from an internal assessment that was never meant to be released. It stated plainly that the shadows appeared most frequently in areas where classified research into intelligence, physics, and biological anomalies was conducted. This pattern implied the shadows were not random occurrences but deliberate observers, entities that were aware of human activities and were choosing to watch, evaluate, or perhaps simply wait. At the end of one archived memo, almost as an afterthought, an anonymous analyst had written a single sentence that stood out from the usually rigid structure of CIA documentation. If these beings can walk freely inside our most secure facilities, then the question is no longer how they got in. The question is how many times they've been here without us knowing. Chapter 12. The Lost Files on Project Mirror. Attempting contact with parallel realities. By the time whispers of Project Mirror began circulating through the deepest corners of the CIA's classified archives, many of the agency's strangest experiments had already become public knowledge. MKUltra, Stargate, the Gateway Program. But for every disclosed program, there were rumors of others that had never seen daylight. Programs so deeply buried that even mentioning their existence required layers of clearance most agents would never achieve. Project Mirror was one of those programs. It existed only as fragments, destroyed index cards, corrupted catalogue entries, and half-redacted memos referencing operations that were supposedly discontinued long before the public ever learned about consciousness experiments. But the fragments, when pieced together, revealed a disturbing ambition, the attempt to establish communication with parallel versions of Earth. The earliest surviving reference to Mirror was not a document but the absence of one. a numbered space in an old project registry from the late 1970s. The projects before and after it were intact, but Mirror's entry had been burned out of the page. A faint square of discoloration remained where the index card once sat. Someone had gone through the effort of obliterating its summary, but an archivist decades later, reviewing the registry for digitization, noticed that Mirror's project number still appeared in the margins of other unrelated files. These secondary references described equipment requisitions that made no sense for traditional intelligence operations: multi-spectrum resonance chambers, quantum interference detectors, Faraday-isolated observation rooms, something labelled only as perception stabilization apparatus, and a series of requisition orders for psychoactive compounds not found in any medical or chemical databases. One of the clearest surviving fragments came from a routine memo written by a technician assigned to equipment maintenance. It mentioned that the resonance chamber was experiencing cross-field phase disturbances when subjects reported non-local perception overlap. The language was vague and carefully constructed to reveal nothing, but analysts who later studied the memo believed it described attempts to push human consciousness into a state capable of reaching, or at least glimpsing, alternate versions of reality. But the most intriguing and unsettling piece of evidence emerged from a shredded document that was later partially reconstructed by FOIA archivists. It referenced Phase 3 contact attempts, implying that the project had multiple stages and had progressed far beyond observational theory. Phase 3, according to the reconstructed snippet, involved placing highly trained participants into an altered consciousness state inside the resonance chamber, while simultaneously bombarding the room with oscillating electromagnetic fields tuned to match theoretical dimensional boundary frequencies. CIA researchers believed that if consciousness was not confined to the human brain, but instead operated more like a receiver or transmitter, then aligning the brain's signal with alternate frequencies might allow a subject to perceive another version of themselves, or even make contact with an intelligence on the other side. The document fragment ended abruptly, but not before including a note from a participant identified only as Subject 9. According to the note, Subject 9 reported seeing a version of himself standing across the room, observing with a neutral expression, as though waiting for me to say something. The subject attempted to speak, but the hallucination, or whatever it was, mirrored his movements a half-second out of sync. When technicians reviewed the chamber footage afterward, they found nothing unusual on the normal cameras but the depth sensors, experimental equipment designed to detect changes in spatial geometry, briefly registered a second form occupying the same space as Subject 9. The anomaly lasted for 0.47 seconds. Subject 9 never participated in further experiments. The memo notes that he resigned from the program 2 days later, stating simply that he did not want to risk meeting whatever that was again. This was far from the only unsettling account. Another participant claimed that during a Phase 3 attempt, he felt the presence of someone standing directly behind him. He later described it as me, but not me, older, scarred, like he'd been through something unimaginable. Though the participant never physically turned around, insisting he felt he would break something fundamental if he did, the resonance chamber's thermal sensors registered a second heat signature behind him. The signature did not match typical human temperature distribution. Instead of emitting heat, it appeared to absorb it, creating a silhouette of cold within the otherwise warm chamber. Researchers began debating whether the second presence was an alternate version of the participant, or an entirely different entity capable of using the resonance field as a doorway. If the latter was true, then Project Mirror had inadvertently opened more than it had intended. As Mirror's research progressed, the phenomena grew less predictable. In one experiment, the walls of the resonance chamber were reported to ripple as though they were made of liquid instead of steel. Another test triggered a sudden blackout in the entire facility, wiping 6 hours of data and causing every subject in the adjacent dormitory wing to report identical dreams of a room full of mirrors that showed reflections that weren't mine. A technician assigned to the project claimed that the incident logs were deliberately altered afterward to remove references to the blackout's connection to the experiment. He later admitted in an anonymous note that he believed the blackout wasn't a power failure at all, but a temporary collapse of local structural coherence, a polite scientific term for a tear in reality. The destruction of the mirror archives appears to have occurred in the early 1990s, during a broader purge of programs deemed too dangerous, too controversial, or too unexplainable to leave in storage. Officially, this purge was described as a routine removal of outdated files. But one surviving index reconstruction shows 9 boxes assigned to Project Mirror. All 9 were listed as destroyed on the same day, a rare event since records were usually purged in small batches to avoid accidental data loss. What is particularly strange is that while the physical documents were destroyed, digital metadata entries still exist, showing titles and summaries that were never meant to survive. One title reads, Dimensional Boundary Penetration, Attempt Number 4. Another says, Unexpected Observer Interaction, Emergency Shutdown. A third entry, marked with the highest clearance tag used in the entire CIA system, simply reads, Outcome Unknown. And then there is the most troubling entry, one that appears in a system cross-reference long after the program was supposedly terminated. It is dated 2008 and reads, Project Mirror Artifact, Location Restricted. No description, no physical records, just the suggestion that something survived the destruction of the program, something deemed important enough to keep but dangerous enough to hide. The greatest remaining question about Project Mirror is not whether it existed, too many traces point to a real program, but what exactly the researchers made contact with. Were they glimpsing alternate versions of their own subjects? Were they opening pathways into parallel Earths, ones where different choices led to different outcomes? Or were they attracting the attention of entities that were never human in the first place? One of the final surviving sentences from a partially reconstructed field report offers a chilling hint. It reads, The entity made no attempt to cross, but it was clear that it could have, had it wished. What the CIA feared more, successful contact or the possibility that something on the other side was already watching, remains buried in the ashes of the files they destroyed. Chapter 13. The Final Redactions. Documents the CIA still refuses to release. There is a peculiar truth about government secrecy. The most frightening documents are not the ones we've seen. They're the ones we know exist but cannot access. Even after countless FOIA requests, forced declassifications, court orders, leaks, and the slow erosion of Cold War paranoia, there are still thousands of CIA files that remain sealed, not temporarily classified, not under routine review, sealed indefinitely. Many of these documents carry a security designation that almost never appears in public conversation: Security Level Omega. This is the highest clearance tier known to exist within the CIA, and only 8 individuals in the entire agency, past and present, have ever been confirmed to hold it. Files marked with Omega classification do not respond to FOIA requests, congressional oversight, or even internal audits. They exist in a sort of bureaucratic limbo, accessible only to those with explicit in-person authorization. When a document receives an Omega lock, it effectively disappears from the system. But occasionally hints of these documents slip through the cracks. A redacted page number here, a missing reference number there, or a damaged file folder that still bears the faint imprint of a title, long since blacked out with permanent ink. The existence of these files has fueled decades of speculation about their content. Some believe they contain evidence of successful communication with non-human intelligences, entities the CIA first encountered during the early remote viewing experiments. Others argue that the sealed documents contain breakthroughs in mind-interfacing technologies, dangerous enough to destabilize entire governments if ever disclosed. Still others insist that the Omega vaults hide proof of invisible entities operating on Earth, beings that surveillance cameras have captured but conventional sensors cannot detect. The truth, if the fragments are to be believed, is likely far stranger than any single theory. One of the most infamous examples of an Omega-class file is the so-called Vault Zero report. Though the document itself has never been seen, its existence was accidentally confirmed in a declassified FOIA log that listed it by name before someone realized the mistake and recensored it. Analysts who studied the slip believe Vault Zero refers to a hidden storage site, possibly beneath Langley or in a remote facility in Nevada, used to contain objects recovered during experimental research programs. Some former contractors claim the vault includes materials retrieved from non-terrestrial incidents, though no official record of such incidents exists in any known archive. Conspiracy theorists argue that these objects may be fragments of unknown technology, devices that behave unlike anything manufactured on Earth. One reported eyewitness described seeing what looked like a polished metal sphere suspended in mid-air inside a containment chamber, rotating silently without any visible propulsion. Whether this was real or the exaggeration of a frightened contractor remains a matter of debate, but the existence of Vault Zero itself is undisputed. Another deeply buried file, known only through cross-reference logs, is titled Sensory Convergence Protocol, Revision 5. Though its contents are entirely redacted, multiple analysts have noted the timing of its classification, immediately following the final round of experimentation in the Gateway Consciousness program. This timing suggests the protocol may have dealt with the integration of human perception with external fields, possibly electromagnetic, possibly something else entirely. Some theorists argue that the protocol was a step toward creating a stable interface between human consciousness and the anomalous energies detected during remote viewing sessions. The fear, according to whistleblowers, was that prolonged exposure to these energies could alter neural pathways in unpredictable ways. One internal memo states that the protocol should not be implemented until the long-term perceptual risks are fully understood, a statement that is both reassuring and deeply unsettling. Rumours surrounding mind-interfacing technology come mostly from former technicians who worked on early prototypes. According to them, the CIA explored devices capable of amplifying brainwave patterns beyond their natural limits. These devices were said to be able to induce lucid visions, heightened awareness, or even glimpses of distant places, effects similar to remote viewing but with greater precision. But the same devices allegedly cause neurological irregularities in some subjects. One whistleblower described a subject who emerged from a session insisting he could still hear someone speaking inside his thoughts, someone who wasn't him. Follow-up scans reportedly showed unusual electrical activity in parts of the brain normally dormant. Whether this was evidence of actual contact or simply a side effect of neural overstimulation remains unknown, but the documentation of these incidents is believed to be locked behind Omega security. There are also the files believed to contain evidence of invisible entities. These are perhaps the most disturbing of all. A handful of surveillance technicians claim that certain experiments, particularly those involving resonance fields or high-frequency scanning arrays, occasionally recorded shapes or figures that did not appear on normal video feeds. These shapes were not human, nor did they correspond to known animals. They appeared as distortions in the background, like silhouettes cut out of the surrounding environment. In one alleged incident, a figure was recorded standing behind an agent in a secure facility. The agent later reported feeling a sudden chill, as though someone had walked directly through him. The thermal imaging recorded a cold void in the shape of a humanoid form, but the optical camera showed nothing at all. That file, according to several insiders, was immediately sealed at Omega-level. Another case, similarly redacted, involves a remote installation where motion detectors began activating without any visible movement. When the footage was reviewed, analysts found no physical presence, but the magnetic field readings fluctuated as if something passed through the sensors. A junior security officer reportedly saw a dark silhouette move past the door of his workspace, though the camera outside recorded an empty hallway. The incident log from that night is still classified, but a few fragments have been leaked, enough to confirm something truly unexplainable occurred, and enough to raise the question of whether these entities were drawn to the facility by the experiments conducted there. Some whistleblowers claim that the CIA discovered not only evidence of such entities, but also indications that they had been present all along, existing parallel to human perception, like shadows that only certain sensors could detect. A former analyst, speaking under anonymity, said that the agency grew concerned when they realized these entities responded to the resonance fields used in consciousness experiments. According to the analyst, researchers initially believed they were seeing dimensional echoes, leftover impressions from alternate realities. But over time it became clear the shapes were reacting to the equipment, changing position as though observing the observers. The possibility that the CIA's experiments had inadvertently alerted these entities to human activity was considered so dangerous that multiple programs were shut down overnight. The deepest layer of secrecy within the Omega files, however, appears to involve communications, successful or attempted, with non-human intelligence. While no official record of such communication exists, analysts have pointed out numerous references in unrelated documents, suggesting that unexpected responses were received during certain experiments. These responses were not verbal or visual, but came in the form of electromagnetic fluctuations, synchronized brainwave patterns between multiple subjects, or sudden equipment failures that coincided with moments of heightened consciousness activity. In one case, a subject undergoing sensory isolation reported hearing a voice whisper a sequence of numbers. When those numbers were later cross-referenced with facility logs, they matched an access code used only by high-level staff. How the subject could have known this remains a mystery. The portion of the report that followed this incident is fully redacted. What makes these sealed documents particularly haunting is not what they confirm, but what they imply. The sense that the CIA knows far more about the nature of reality, perception, and non-human presence than it will ever reveal. Even the limited leaks and accidental disclosures paint a picture of an agency that has encountered things it cannot fully control or comprehend. The Omega files are not merely classified to protect national security, they appear classified to protect humanity from knowledge it may not be ready to handle. A former intelligence officer once described the Omega vaults as containing the research that should never have been done, the discoveries we wish we had never made, and the questions we're afraid to ask. That statement, vague and ominous as it is, may be the closest anyone has ever come to describing what lies behind those sealed doors. Because as much as the CIA fears external threats, it fears something far more profound. The possibility that the universe is not what we think it is, that other intelligences exist alongside us, and that the experiments meant to explore the edges of human consciousness may have opened a doorway that cannot easily be closed. The final redactions, then, are not simply omissions, they are warnings. Warnings about what lies beyond the boundary of perception. warnings about what can be heard when the mind reaches too far, and warnings whispered through layers of ink and blacked out pages that some truths are dangerous not because they are unbelievable but because they are true.